The rain in Philadelphia doesn't just fall, it seeps into your bones, carrying the scent of wet soot and old secrets. 3 days after we lowered my son, Garrett, into the cold earth of Laurel Hill Cemetery, his widow looked me dead in the eye and told me I was a ghost. We were standing in the gilded foyer of the Marion Cricket Club, surrounded by the hushed whispers of mainline elite and the clinking of expensive crystal. Sloan Montgomery, a woman who had carried my son's name for 5 years but never his heart, didn't even wait for the guests to clear out before she twisted the knife. "You're dead to this family, Harrison," she whispered, her voice a sharp blade wrapped in velvet. "Just like your son. You're an anchor, a relic of a past we're moving beyond. Don't look for Leo. Don't call. From this moment on, the Sterling name starts and ends with me. My name is Harrison Sterling. I'm 74 years old. And to the world, and especially to Sloan, I am a footnote, an embarrassing smudge on her carefully curated social canvas. She saw a man who'd peaked as a floor foreman at a steel mill, a pensioner who wore a Muy-Lum-Do-La Goodwill blazer and took the SEPTA bus because he supposedly couldn't afford the gas for a decent car. She had no idea that she was standing in the path of a landslide, and I was the one who had spent 40 years carving the mountain. What Sloan didn't know about my past wasn't just a secret. It was a death sentence for her ambitions. But as I stood there, feeling the dampness of my cheap suit against my skin, I didn't yell. I didn't break a glass. I simply watched her walk away, her designer heels clicking a rhythm of triumph on the marble. I knew something she didn't. The quietest man in the room is often the one who built the room. The humiliation didn't start at the funeral, though. It had been a slow, agonizing erosion. Sloan had been chipping away at my dignity since the day she married Garrett in Hangin Lair Hai Mui Hai. I remember that first dinner at their sprawling estate in Gladwin. Garrett had invited me over, wanting me to share the story of how his mother, Eleanor, and I had survived the winter of Bai Mui Chin on nothing but canned soup and grit. Sloan had interrupted me before I could even finish the first sentence. "Harrison, dear, I think we've heard enough about the glory days of manual labor," she'd said, flashing a smile that never reached her eyes. "Garrett is a senior VP now. We really should focus on the future, don't you think? And please, use the salad fork. It's the smaller one on the far left. I have a master's from Penn. I'm very particular about the optics of our household." Garrett had just looked down at his plate, the shadow of the man I'd raised flickering in his eyes before being snuffed out by his desire to keep the peace. He'd inherited Eleanor's kindness, but he hadn't yet found the iron spine I'd tried to forge in him. It broke my heart to see him shrink in his own home. The pattern only grew more vicious. When Garrett was diagnosed with stage 3 esophageal cancer last year, Sloan turned the hospital into a fortress. I was blocked from the oncology meetings. I was told the Motram Mui, Cum Do La experimental treatments were being handled by real professionals and immediate family only. "This is a delicate time, Harrison," she told me outside the Jefferson Health offices, her eyes scanning my worn work boots with visible disgust. "Garrett needs to be surrounded by people who can actually contribute to his care, not people who need a map to find the billing department. Stay in your lane." I could have written a check for the entire hospital wing right then and there. I could have flown in the best surgeons from Zurich on a private jet. But I stayed silent. I stayed in the lane I had chosen decades ago, the lane of the invisible man. Sloan saw a pensioner living in a Boardroom Mui Do-La a month studio apartment on Passyunk Avenue, a man who ate at diners and read the physical newspaper. She saw exactly what I wanted the world to see, never imagining that the factory worker she despised was the architect of the very industry she was trying to climb. During Garrett's final weeks, she tightened the noose. Visiting hours for me were restricted to 20 minutes on Tuesday mornings, times when Garrett was most likely to be sedated. She was managing his transition, she said. Managing it like a corporate merger. The funeral on December Mui 10th was a cold, clinical affair. Sloan had picked a package that screamed status without an ounce of soul. I paid the Mot Hai Trum Do-La rental fee for the reception hall through an anonymous trust, a detail she didn't bother to investigate. She sat in the front row, draped in black silk, holding 6-year-old Leo's hand like a prop. I was relegated to the 4th row, behind Garrett's college friends and Sloan's important business associates. But it was the reception where she finally decided to bury me alongside my son. There were about 60 people there, mostly suit and tie types from Vanguard Industrial Systems, the company Garrett worked for. Sloan stood up near the catering table, tapping a silver spoon against a flute of champagne. The room fell into a practiced, respectful silence. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice projecting with the practiced ease of a woman who expected to be heard. Garrett was a man of ambition. He understood that to lead, one must distance oneself from the mediocrity of the past. He worked tirelessly to build a legacy that was distinct from his beginnings. She turned her gaze toward me, her eyes hardening into flint. "Harrison Sterling," she said, her voice rising so that even the waitstaff stopped moving. "You've spent your life as a cog in a machine you didn't own. You never built anything of substance. You never contributed a single meaningful thing to the progress of this city. Garrett felt a sense of duty toward you, a pity-born obligation, but that duty died with him. I won't have my son, Leo, growing up under the influence of a man who defines himself by what he didn't achieve." A collective gasp rippled through the room. My old friend Silas, who'd worked the docks with me 40 years ago, took a step forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of red, but I caught his eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. Sloane walked over to my chair, looming over me. "The funeral is over, Harrison. Your time in this family is over. Pack up whatever memories you think you have and get out. You're nothing but a ghost in a cheap blazer." 60 people stared at me. Some looked away in shame. Others looked at me with the same clinical detachment Sloane had practiced for years. I didn't flinch. I carefully folded my linen napkin, tucked it into my pocket, and stood up. My joints popped a reminder of years spent on the factory floor before the boardrooms took over, and I reached into my inner pocket. I didn't pull out a handkerchief. I pulled out my phone. I didn't look at Sloane as I dialed. I waited for the third ring. "Claire," I said, my voice low but carrying a weight that seemed to anchor the room. "It's Harrison. We need to talk about the Montgomery woman. Yes, she's exactly who we thought. Move the board meeting for Vanguard Industrial to January 10th. It's time to settle the estate. All of it." Sloane's brow furrowed. She looked at the phone, then back at me, a flicker of something not quite fear, but a nagging confusion crossing her face. Who was Claire? Why did the factory worker sound like he was giving orders to a general? I walked toward the exit, pausing only when I reached the heavy oak doors. I turned back to the room, my eyes locking onto Sloane's for the final time that afternoon. "You were right about one thing, Sloane," I said quietly. "Garrett would want Leo to have a role model who understands the value of what's been built. He just wouldn't want that role model to be a parasite who doesn't know who owns the host." I stepped out into the Philadelphia rain, the heavy doors thudding shut behind me. I walked 3 blocks to a waiting black sedan, not a bus, and climbed into the back seat. As we pulled away from the club, I looked at the small, leather-bound notebook I'd kept in my pocket for 10 years. It was Eleanor's. My wife had died a decade ago, her lungs giving out after a lifetime of breathing in the same city dust I had. In her final days, she'd grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "Don't let them erase us, Harrison," she'd whispered. "Our name. It isn't just about the money we made. It's about the sweat that came before it. If someone tries to rewrite our story to fit their vanity, you show them the ink we used. Promise me." I'd promised. And now, Sloane was trying to do exactly what Eleanor had feared. She was rewriting Garrett as a man who was ashamed of his father. She was turning my grandson into a stranger. She was attempting to cut the roots of a tree I had planted with my own 2 hands. As the car glided through the rain-slicked streets of Center City, passing the towering headquarters of Vanguard Industrial Systems, a building I had commissioned in Mungin Chin Trum, Chin Mui Tarm, I realized this wasn't just about a bruised ego. It was about a rescue mission. Leo was 6. He was at the age where he was learning how to measure the world. If I stayed silent, he would grow up believing that a person's worth was measured by the label on their suit and the coldness in their heart. He would grow up thinking his grandfather was a failure because he didn't shout his worth from the rooftops. I had 30 days until the board meeting. 30 days to let Sloane believe she had won. 30 days to watch her spend money that didn't belong to her and make promises she couldn't keep. But as I reached my apartment, I saw a manila envelope tucked into my doorframe. No return address. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of old books and lemon polish greeting me, and tore it open. Inside was a single photograph and a legal notice. The photograph was of Leo, sitting in the back of a car, looking out the window with an expression of pure, heartbreaking loneliness. The legal notice was a restraining order, filed by Sloane Montgomery, citing my unstable financial and mental status as a threat to the child's well-being. She wasn't just kicking me out of the family. She was trying to legally erase my existence before I could even say goodbye. I sat down at my small kitchen table, the light from a single bulb casting long shadows across the room. I didn't know it yet, But Sloane had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she was playing a game of social chess. She didn't realize she was playing against the man who had manufactured the board, the pieces, and the table they sat on. I picked up the phone again. "Silas?" I said when my old friend answered. "Remember that favor you owed me from Tam Mui High? The one involving the private investigators in Kensington? I need them. All of them. I want to know every cent Sloane Montgomery has spent in the last 48 hours. And Silas, tell them to look into her father's old money connections. I have a feeling the Montgomery pedigree is as thin as the paper this restraining order is printed on. What I found out that night would change the trajectory of the next month. Sloane wasn't just an opportunist. She was a woman with a secret that made my hidden billions look like child's play. And as the clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, I knew that the January 10th board meeting wasn't going to be a promotion for her. It was going to be an execution. The manila envelope wasn't the only thing waiting for me that night. Within 2 hours, Silas called back. Silas Cutter Vane was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a Philadelphia pier, all rough edges and salt-stained wisdom. He'd been my head of security back when Vanguard Industrial was just a series of smoke-belching chimneys along the Delaware River, and he was the only person who knew exactly where the bodies and the billions were buried. "Harrison," Silas's voice was a low growl over the encrypted line. "You were right to trust your gut. The Montgomerys of Greenwich don't exist. Or rather, they exist, but they haven't seen a dime of their own money since the housing crash of High Yin Lair Tarm. Sloane's father, Sterling Montgomery, ironic name, I know is a professional ghost. He's been living off credit cards and the fumes of a reputation that evaporated 15 years ago. Sloane didn't marry Garrett for love, and she didn't marry him for his VP salary. She married him because she thought the Sterling name was her ticket back into the tax bracket she'd been evicted from. I leaned back in my chair, the springs groaning. I should have seen it then. I should have seen the hunger in her eyes that first night Garrett brought her to the Passyunk diner to meet me. He had been so proud, beaming like a kid who'd won the lottery. I'd played my part, the blue-collar dad in the grease-stained jacket, talking about the good old days at the mill. I wanted to see if she could handle the reality of where Garrett came from. She'd been enchanted, she said. She called it authentic. But I saw the way she handled her coffee cup like it was contaminated. She wasn't enchanted by the history. She was calculating the distance between that diner and the penthouse she intended to own. What she didn't know was that I owned the diner, the block it sat on, and the bank that held her father's mountain of debt. I had stayed in the shadows for a reason. In the Cheen Muis, when the unions were volatile and the competition was cutthroat, being an invisible billionaire was a survival strategy. By the time I retired, it had become a way of life. It was a filter. It allowed me to see people for who they really were when they thought I could do nothing for them. And Sloane had failed the test every single day for 5 years. "There's more, Harrison," Silas continued. "She's been talking to a liquidator. Not for Garrett's estate, she's already gutted his savings, but for the Sterling family trust. She thinks there's a vault somewhere with Eleanor's jewelry and your factory pension. Settlements. She's been trying to find the paperwork for the property in Bucks County." I felt a cold prickle of anger. The Bucks County property wasn't just land. It was the farmhouse where Eleanor and I had spent our summers, the place where Garrett had learned to fish, the place where I had buried Eleanor's ashes under the old willow tree. It was sacred. "Let her look," I said, my voice like grinding stones. "The property isn't in my name. It's held by an LLC she'll never crack. But Silas, I want you to leak something. Give her a breadcrumb. Let her think there's a major asset hidden in Garrett's old office at the Vanguard building. Something she can't get to without a key she thinks I have." The open loop was set. Sloane was a shark. If she didn't smell blood, she'd go looking for it elsewhere. I needed her focused on a prize that didn't exist while I moved the real pieces into place. The next morning, I ignored the restraining order. Not because I'm a lawbreaker, but because I know the man who signed it, Judge Miller. He'd been a junior clerk when I helped fund his first campaign. I called him at SAW, Hung AM, by Tarm. Hung AM. The order was under administrative review, though Sloane didn't know that yet. I went to Leo's school, the Kensington Preparatory Academy. It was a place of high walls and even higher tuition, Bournway High, $100 a year, which I paid through a scholarship fund Sloane believed was a legacy gift from Garrett's firm. I stood by the black iron gates, watching the line of Range Rovers and Porsches drop off children who looked like miniature hedge fund managers. Leo saw me first. He broke rank from the line, his heavy backpack bobbing as he ran toward me. "Grandpa!" I knelt down, catching him in a hug that smelled of maple syrup and laundry detergent. For a moment, the weight of the last 3 days vanished. "Hey there, little man. How's the bridge coming?" We'd been working on a balsa wood model of the Benjamin Franklin Bridge. It was supposed to be our project for the winter. "Mom said you went away," Leo whispered, his eyes searching mine with a terrifying amount of adult concern. "She said you were tired and had to go to a facility for old people." I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated vitriol for Sloan. To lie to a child about his grandfather's sanity was a level of low I hadn't prepared for. "I'm not tired, Leo, and I'm not going anywhere. Your mom she's confused about some things. Builders don't just disappear, remember? Always finish the foundation," he recited, a small smile breaking through. "Master Sterling." A sharp voice cut through the morning air. It was the headmistress, a woman named Beatrice Sterling Kensington, no relation, just the kind of name that cost Matrum Dola an hour to maintain. She was marching toward us, her face a mask of professional alarm. "Mr. Sterling, I've been informed there is a legal directive regarding your presence here." "The directive is under review, Beatrice," I said, standing up and dusting off my knees. I looked her in the eye, the look that used to make CFOs sweat. "And since I am the primary benefactor of the Eleanor Sterling Arts Wing your school is currently constructing, I suggest you call Judge Miller before you call the police." She froze. The anonymous donor wasn't supposed to have a face, let alone the face of the man she'd been told was a nuisance. I wasn't aware. Most people aren't. That's the point. I patted Leo on the head. "Go on, Leo. I'll see you soon. And remember, the tension cables are the secret to the span. Don't let them sag." As Leo ran back to the building, I saw a familiar silver BMW X buyer pull up to the curb. Sloan. She didn't even park. She screeched to a halt, jumping out of the car with her phone already in her hand. Her face was contorted with a rage that stripped away all her old money pretenses. "You senile old bastard," she screamed, oblivious to the other parents staring. "I told you!" "You're done. You're violating a court order. I'll have you in a cell by lunch." I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I just checked my watch. "You're late for your meeting at Vanguard, Sloan. The Strategic Development Committee waits for no one, especially not a junior consultant who's currently making a scene in front of the city's most influential parents." She stopped mid-stride, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "How do you know about that meeting? And don't you dare mention my career. You worked in a pit, Harrison. You wouldn't know a strategic development meeting from a lunch break. I know that Vanguard is looking for a new VP," I said, stepping closer until I could see the frantic pulse in her neck. "And I know you've been telling the board that you have exclusive access to the Sterling family's industrial patents that Garrett supposedly left to you." Her eyes widened. This was the breadcrumb Silas had dropped. She thought she'd found the hidden asset, a series of proprietary steel-hardening blueprints that were worth tens of millions. "Garrett did leave them to me," she hissed, regaining her footing. "In spirit. And once I find the originals in your dusty little apartment, they'll be mine, in fact. I'm going to use your legacy to buy the life you were too pathetic to live, Harrison. By the time I'm done, the name Sterling will mean power, not poverty." "Then you'd better go, Sloan. Opportunity only knocks once. Sometimes it's just a trapdoor disguised as a promotion." She sneered, threw herself back into her car, and roared away, splashing muddy water onto my shins. I stood there for a long time, watching the taillights disappear. She was heading into the heart of my empire, thinking she was the conqueror. She didn't know that the CEO, Claire, had been my protégé for 20 years. She didn't know that the Strategic Development Committee was a hand-picked group of my most loyal associates, but there was a darker thread to this tapestry. As I walked back toward the bus stop, keeping up the appearance for the cameras, I knew Silas had tucked around the school. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Silas. "Harrison, we checked the medical records Sloan tried to seal. The experimental treatments Garrett was getting, they weren't just expensive, they were unapproved. And Sloan was receiving consultation fees from the pharmaceutical startup that provided them. She wasn't just managing his care, she was using him as a paycheck." The world seemed to tilt. My son hadn't just died of cancer. He had died while his wife was profiting from his final breaths, using him as a human lab rat to pad her Montgomery lifestyle. The grief I'd been carrying for 3 days suddenly solidified into something else. It was no longer a heavy weight, it was a sharpened edge. Revenge is a dish best served cold, they say. But when it involves the life of your only son, it's served with the heat of a blast furnace. I didn't go home to my studio apartment. I walked into a quiet, nondescript office building in Old City and took the private elevator to the penthouse. There, waiting for me, was a tailor I'd known for 30 years and a barber who didn't ask questions. "The board meeting is in 21 days, Harrison," Claire said, walking into the room as the tailor measured my shoulders. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the same steel I felt in my gut. "Sloan has already submitted her vision for the company. She's proposing we liquidate the pension fund to finance an elite lifestyle division. She's literally trying to steal the retirement of the men you worked with for 40 years. She's ambitious," I said, watching my reflection in the mirror. The factory worker was disappearing, replaced by the man who had shaped the skyline of Philadelphia. "But she's forgotten the first rule of manufacturing." "What's that?" "If you don't understand how the machine works, you shouldn't put your hands inside it." I looked at the suit, charcoal gray, Italian silk, costing more than Sloane's car. I wouldn't wear it yet, not until the moment of maximum impact. I wanted her to see the pathetic old man one last time. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her contempt before I crushed her with it. But then, the open loop I'd set for Sloane took a turn I hadn't expected. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Sterling?" The voice was shaky young. "My name is Jax. I'm a courier. I was hired by your son, Garrett." 3 weeks before he passed. He gave me a package. He said if anything happened to him, and if his wife ever tried to reorganize the family, I should find you. But he told me not to go to your apartment. He gave me a different address. "Where are you, Jax?" "I'm at the steel mill, the old one on the river." He said the truth was in the foundation. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Philadelphia rain. Garrett knew. He'd known what Sloane was, and he'd left me a weapon from beyond the grave. But as I prepared to head to the mill, I saw a news alert on the TV in the tailor's shop. Breaking news. A suspicious fire has broken out at the historic Sterling Mill on the Delaware River. Fire crews are on the scene, but the building is a total loss. Sloane wasn't just looking for the patents. She was burning the evidence. What happened next would change everything. The smell of burning creosote and sulfur is something you never forget. It's the scent of a dying era, the smell of the very foundation of my life being reduced to ash. As the black sedan raced toward the riverfront, the orange glow against the Philadelphia skyline looked like a sunset that had gone horribly wrong. Silas was driving, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his jaw set in a hard line that told me he was already calculating the cost not in dollars, but in blood. I sat in the back. The charcoal suit, I'd just been fitted, for feeling like a suit of armor I wasn't quite ready to wear. I looked at my hands calloused, scarred, and stained with decades of honest labor. Sloane thought these hands were a mark of failure. She didn't realize they were the tools that had built the very ground she walked on. But as I watched the smoke billow over the Delaware, I felt a hollow ache in my chest that no amount of money could fill. That mill wasn't just a building. It was where I'd proposed to Eleanor during a midnight shift in Ngin Chin Trum by Muitarm. It was where Garrett had taken his first steps on a Saturday morning while I finished a custom weld. "She's ahead of us." "Harrison," Silas muttered, glancing at the rearview mirror. The fire started in the basement level, the old Retner's room. Whoever set it knew exactly where the structural weak points were. If Jax was in there. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. When we arrived, the scene was a chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting. Firefighters from the Bourne district were battling a blaze that seemed possessed, lashing out from the shattered windows of the Sterling Mill. I stepped out of the car, the heat hitting me like a physical blow. Standing near the perimeter, draped in a designer trench coat that cost more than most people make in a month, was Sloane. She was holding a handkerchief to her nose, her eyes wide with what looked like shock. To anyone else, she was a grieving widow watching her family's history burn. To me, she was a vulture admiring her work. I walked toward her, the gravel crunching under my boots. She didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. When she turned, the mask of grief didn't just slip, it shattered. "Harrison, what are you doing here? This is a restricted area. The police." "The police are busy, Sloane," I said, my voice as cold as the river behind us. "And this mill belongs to me. Always has. I think the real question is, why are you here? You told me 3 days ago that I was a relic of a past you were moving beyond. Yet here you are, standing in the ashes of that past at 2 in the morning. She recovered quickly, her eyes narrowing. "I'm the executor of Garrett's estate. I have a duty to protect his interests. This fire is a tragedy, but perhaps it's for the best." This place was a death trap, a reminder of a life Garrett worked so hard to escape. He hated this mill, Harrison. He told me it smelled like failure. That was the first lie of many that night. Garrett loved the mill. He loved the noise, the heat, the feeling of creating something tangible. He had spent his teenage summers here, learning that a man's worth isn't measured by his title, but by the integrity of his work. Sloane was trying to rewrite my son's soul, and for a moment, the urge to reveal everything, to show her the deed, the bank accounts, the sheer scale of the empire she was trying to steal, was almost overwhelming. But I held back. A cornered animal is dangerous, but an arrogant one is predictable. Is that what he told you? I asked quietly. Or is that what you told yourself while you were taking kickbacks from pharmaceutical startups to turn him into a clinical trial? Sloane's face went bone white. The fire reflected in her pupils, making her look like something out of a fever dream. I don't know what you're talking about. You're rambling. The grief has finally broken you, Harrison. I'll make sure the fire marshal knows you were seen wandering the grounds before the blaze started. A confused, bitter old man looking for a way to get back at the daughter-in-law who outshined him? It's a very compelling narrative. She turned on her heel and walked toward the fire captain, her voice already shifting into a frantic, high-pitched plea for help. She was good. I'll give her that. She was a master of the narrative. But she had forgotten one thing. Narratives are built on facts, and I had spent 40 years manufacturing the facts of this city. Silas approached me as she walked away. Jax is out. He jumped from a second-story window before the stairs collapsed. He's with my team now. He's got the package, Harrison, and he saw who sparked the match. Was it her? Not her directly. A contractor. A guy named Blackwood. He's a specialist in unfortunate accidents for the mainline crowd. But Jax says Garrett didn't just leave a package, he left a recording. He knew he wasn't going to make it, and he knew Sloane was the reason why. We left the inferno behind, heading to a safe house Silas kept in South Philly, a brick row home that looked like 1,000 others but was reinforced with greater security. Jax was there, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face smudged with soot. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and terror. He was just a kid, maybe 21, caught in a war between titans. "Mr. Sterling," he rasped, handing me a heavy, fire-blackened metal box. He told me that if the mill burned, the truth would be in the foundation. I didn't understand what he meant until the fire started. The floorboards in the office. They weren't just wood. There's a sub-level. A vault Garrett built himself. I opened the box. Inside was a digital recorder and a stack of letters tied with a piece of twine. My hands trembled as I pressed play. Garrett's voice filled the small room, thin and raspy from the cancer, but carrying that same stubborn cadence I remembered from his childhood. "Dad, if you're hearing this, it means I was too weak to finish what I started. I'm sorry." I let her in, and by the time I realized who Sloane really was, she had her claws in everything. She thinks she's winning. She thinks she's erased you, but I know better. I've been funneling the consultation fees she's been taking back into a hidden account. Every cent she stole from my life insurance, every bribe she took from the doctors. It's all there. And Dad. She's not a Montgomery. Her real name is Sarah Jenkins. She's from a trailer park in Scranton, and she's been running from a fraud conviction since she was 20. She didn't just marry me for the name, she married me to hide. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool metal of the box. My son had spent his final, agonizing months fighting a silent war to protect my legacy, all while I thought he had been turned against me. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my lungs. I had let him die thinking I was a failure because I was too caught up in my own invisible man game. "There's more, Harrison," Jax said softly. "The recording. It goes on. She's planning to move Leo to Europe. She's already applied for a fast-track visa under her maiden name. She's going to disappear after the board meeting on the 10th. She's going to take the liquidation money and the boy, and you'll never see him again." That was the line. The fire, the insults, the theft, I could handle all of that. But taking Leo, taking the last living piece of Garrett and Eleanor, that was the moment Harrison Sterling, the quiet factory worker, died for good. I stood up, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt the full power of the man I used to be. "Silas, call Claire. Tell her the board meeting isn't just about the VP position anymore. We're going to invite the press. And I want a full background check on Sarah Jenkins from Scranton. Every unpaid parking ticket, every bounce check, every lie she ever told to get into those fancy schools." "What about the mill?" Silas asked. "Let it burn," I said. "The foundation is made of reinforced concrete and the truth. Fire can't touch that. But I want you to find Blackwood. If he's the one who set that fire, I want him to know that he didn't just burn a building. He lit the fuse on a bomb that's going to level everything Sloan Montgomery has ever built. As the night wore on, I sat by the window, watching the city wake up. I thought about the first family dinner in Hang In Lair Heimwee High. I remembered the way Sloan had looked at my Muilum Dola blazer. I remembered the way she'd corrected my grammar. She'd spent 3 years trying to make me feel small. She'd spent 3 years treating the world like a stage where she was the only star. What she didn't realize was that I was the one who owned the theater. But the next morning brought a twist I hadn't prepared for. As I was preparing to head to the Vanguard headquarters to meet Claire, my phone buzzed with a news alert. It wasn't about the fire. It was a photo of me taken at Leo's school the day before. The headline read, "Local pensioner Harrison Sterling sought for questioning in connection to mill arson. Family expresses concern over his declining mental state." Sloan wasn't waiting for the board meeting. She was moving for the kill. She had leaked the photo and a fabricated story about my obsession with the mill to the local news. She was painting me as a disgruntled arsonist before I could even make my first move. I looked at Silas. "She's fast." "She's desperate," Silas countered. "And desperate people make mistakes. Look at the bottom of the article." I scrolled down. There was a quote from a family spokesperson stating that Sloan Montgomery was offering a Nummui Kong Dola reward for any information leading to my safe recovery and medical evaluation. She was literally putting a bounty on my head, disguised as an act of mercy. She wants me in a psych ward before the 10th, I realized. If I'm committed, I can't vote my shares. I can't speak at the meeting. And she gains full control over Leo as my sole legal guardian in the event of my incapacitation. "We need to move the timeline up," Silas said. "No," I replied, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. "We're going to do exactly what she wants. We're going to give her a safe recovery. But we're going to do it in front of the one group of people she fears more than anyone else." "Who?" "The people she's been pretending to be for the last 5 years. I picked up the phone and called the one person who could make it happen. "Dr. Davis, it's Harrison Sterling. I think it's time for that introduction to your husband, but I'm going to need a very specific favor. It involves a public appearance and a very expensive medical emergency." What Sloan didn't know was that while she was playing checkers with the local news, I was about to turn her entire life into a televised tragedy. But as we pulled out of the South Philly safe house, I saw a black SUV with tinted windows pull out behind us. It wasn't Silas's team, and it wasn't the police. "We've got company," Silas said, reaching for the holster under his arm. The war had moved from the boardrooms to the streets, and as the SUV sped up, aiming for our rear bumper, I realized that Sloan wasn't just trying to commit me. She was trying to make sure I didn't survive the trip to the hospital. The black SUV didn't just follow us, it hunted us. As Silas took a sharp, screeching turn onto Washington Avenue, the tires of the sedan protesting against the cold asphalt, the pursuer stayed glued to our bumper. This wasn't a private investigator or a curious reporter. This was Silas's world, the gritty, unpolished underside of the city where problems were solved with impact rather than ink. "Hold on, Harrison," Silas growled, his eyes darting between the mirrors and the road ahead. He didn't wait for a reply before he slammed the car into a lower gear and swung us toward the maze of the South Philadelphia Navy Yard. The old industrial skeletons of the shipyard loomed like ghosts in the gray morning light. "If they want to play in the dirt, let's take them to the playground." He pulled a maneuver I hadn't seen since the labor riots of Chinwe High. A high-speed J-turn that sent us sliding between 2 rusted shipping containers. The SUV, caught off guard by the sheer aggression of the move, overstepped. It swerved to avoid a stack of iron beams, losing its momentum just long enough for Silas to dive into an alleyway shrouded by heavy tarp and shadows. We sat there in the sudden silence, the engine ticking as it cooled, while the roar of the SUV faded into the distance. "That was Blackwood," Silas said, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "He's not trying to commit you, Harrison. He was aiming for the driver's side door at 60 miles an hour. Sloan isn't looking for a medical evaluation anymore. She's looking for a settlement from the life insurance company. You're worth more to her as a tragic accident than a senile grandfather." The realization hit me harder than the car chase. She wasn't just cold, she was lethal. She had calculated the risk and decided that my life was less valuable than the delay I was causing in her takeover. I looked at my hands, still steady despite the adrenaline. "She's desperate, Silas." The Sarah Jenkins from Scranton is coming out. She's forgotten the Montgomery polish and reverted to the survival instincts of a cornered thief. But while we were hiding in the shadows of the Navy Yard, Sloan was winning the war of public perception. We found a small diner with a television in the corner, the news ticker scrolling across the bottom of the screen like a countdown to my execution. There she was, Sloan Montgomery, dressed in a muted navy wool dress, standing on the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She looked like a saint of the main line. "My father-in-law, Harrison, is a man of a different era," she told the gathered reporters, her voice trembling with a practiced, heartbreaking fragility. "We loved him, and we tried to support him through the loss of our beloved Garrett. But the trauma, it has triggered a cognitive decline we weren't prepared for. He's become obsessed with the old mill, seeing ghosts of an industry that hasn't existed in decades. We are devastated by the arson, but we are more devastated by the man he's become. All we want is for him to come home so he can receive the professional care he so desperately needs." The screen cut to a photo of me, distorted, grainy, taken from a security camera. I looked old. I looked confused. I looked like exactly what she wanted the world to see. A burden. "She's good," I whispered, the coffee in the diner tasting like ash. "She's using my silence as a confession. Every day I don't show up to defend myself, her story becomes the truth." "Then let's change the story," Silas said. We spent the next 48 hours in a tactical retreat. While Sloan moved into the Vanguard headquarters, occupying Garrett's old office and beginning the audit that was really just a search for the liquidation codes, we were building a counter-narrative. I met with Dr. Patricia Davis at a private clinic in Chestnut Hill. She wasn't just a CEO. Her husband, Dr. Alistair Davis, was the head of neurosurgery at Penn. "Harrison, I've looked at the evidence Sloan's team leaked," Alistair said, tossing a folder onto his mahogany desk. "It's a hack job. They've doctored medical notes from your son's records to suggest a hereditary predisposition to early-onset dementia. It's medically impossible given the specifics of Garrett's condition, but for a layperson on a jury or a board of directors, it looks terrifying." "Can you disprove it?" I asked. "I can do better. I can prove that you've been undergoing annual baseline cognitive assessments with me for the last 5 years as part of a philanthropic study on aging leaders, because you have. Or rather, you will have, once we backdate these files into our secure, encrypted server. It's not a lie, Harrison. It's an adjustment of the record to reflect the reality you've lived." While the doctors built the fortress of my sanity, Silas's team hit the Scranton Trail. They found the real Montgomery legacy. It wasn't a fall from grace. It was a climb from the gutter, built on the bones of others. Sloan hadn't just changed her name. She had left a trail of ruined small businesses and investors in her wake. She was a professional parasite who had finally found a host big enough to feed her for a lifetime. But the most painful escalation came through a video Silas intercepted from the Gladwin Estates nursery monitor. I watched as Sloan sat with Leo, my grandson, on the edge of his bed. She wasn't reading him a story. She was showing him pictures of me. "Remember, Leo," she said, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern. "Grandpa Harrison is very sick in his brain. He might say things that sound like secrets, or he might try to take you away. If you see him, you have to run to a grown-up. He's not the man Daddy loved anymore. He's someone else now. Someone dangerous." Leo looked at her with wide, confused eyes. "But he's building the bridge, Mommy." He said builders don't disappear. "The bridge is broken, Leo. Just like Grandpa." I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from punching the screen. She was poisoning the only thing I had left. She was turning my grandson into a weapon against my own heart. I realized then that a boardroom victory wouldn't be enough. I didn't just want her fired, I wanted her erased from his life the way she had tried to erase me from his history. The tension reached a breaking point on January Bard, 5 days before the meeting. Sloan, emboldened by my disappearance and the reward she'd posted, made her most aggressive move yet. She held a gala at the Union League of Philadelphia, ostensibly to honor Garrett's memory, but really to court the private equity firms she needed to finalize the liquidation of Vanguard Industrial. She had invited the elite, the powerful, and the media. It was a victory lap before the race was even over. "We're going," I told Silas as I looked at the invitation he'd swiped from a disgruntled secretary's desk. "Harrison, that's suicide. Blackwood will be there. The police will be there. They'll have you in handcuffs before you hit the buffet." "No, they won't," I said, a slow, predatory calm settling over me. "Because I'm not going as Harrison Sterling, the factory worker. I'm going as the man who owns the building, and I'm bringing the one person Sloan Montgomery never expected to see again." "Who?" "Her mother." Silas stared at me, a grin slowly spreading across his scarred face. "Scranton? You found her?" I found her in a nursing home that Sloan hadn't paid the bill for in 6 months. A woman named Martha Jenkins who thinks her daughter is a travel agent in London. It turns out, when you're busy building a fake life in Philadelphia, you tend to forget the real one you left behind in the coal mines. The night of the gala was a masterpiece of mainline opulence. The Union League was draped in white lilies and black silk. Sloan stood at the top of the grand staircase, a diamond necklace glittering against her throat, a necklace that had belonged to my wife, Eleanor. She was holding court, laughing with the very people who had once looked down on her, convinced she was one of them. She felt untouchable. She felt like a Montgomery. I arrived in the back of a nondescript catering van. I was dressed in the Bourne, Condola charcoal suit, my hair cut by the best barber in the city, my posture straight and commanding. I looked like a man who owned empires, because I did. Beside me sat Martha Jenkins, a frail woman in a simple floral dress, her eyes clouded with the early stages of the very illness Sloan had accused me of having. "Wait for my signal, Silas," I whispered into my earpiece. I stepped out of the shadows and into the ballroom. The music was playing a soft, string quartet version of a song Garrett had loved. I walked through the crowd, and it was as if a vacuum of silence followed me. People turned, their conversations dying mid-sentence. They didn't recognize the factory worker from the news, but they recognized the energy of a man who belonged in that room more than they did. I reached the bottom of the staircase just as Sloan was finishing a toast to Garrett's vision of a modern, streamlined future. She looked down, her wine glass halfway to her lips, and her eyes locked onto mine. For 5 seconds, the world stopped. The glass didn't just slip from her hand. It seemed to explode as it hit the marble floor. "Harrison?" she gasped, her voice cracking the silence. "What? How?" "You look beautiful, Sloan," I said, my voice projecting to every corner of the room. "The pearls look better on you than they did on Eleanor. But I think you've forgotten something in your haste to streamline our family." She scrambled for her narrative, her eyes darting toward the security guards. "Someone call the police. This man is unstable. He's the arsonist." "I'm the owner of this building, Sloan," I interrupted, my voice a thunderclap. "And I'm the majority shareholder of Vanguard Industrial. But more importantly, I'm a son who believes in taking care of his parents." I stepped aside, and Silas wheeled Martha Jenkins into the center of the light. "Sarah?" Martha asked, her voice thin and confused as she looked up at the woman on the stairs. "Sarah, honey, is that you? Why are you wearing those fancy clothes? And where have you been?" The home said the checks stopped coming. The room went deathly quiet. The Montgomery name, the old money heritage, the Greenwich upbringing, it all evaporated in the heat of that single, desperate question. The elite of Philadelphia watched in stunned silence as their golden girl was unmasked by a woman who looked like she'd spent her life behind a cash register. Sloane's face went through a terrifying transformation. The mask of the grieving widow dissolved, replaced by the raw, jagged fury of Sarah Jenkins. "Get her out of here," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at her own mother. "I don't know this woman. This is a setup." "Harrison, you've lost your mind." "I haven't lost my mind, Sarah," I said, stepping onto the first stair. "I've just found my son's recording, the one where he explains exactly how you were managing his care, the one where he talks about the secret accounts in the Cayman Islands, the one where he tells me that you're not a Montgomery, you're just a thief who got lucky." Blackwood stepped out from the wings, his hand reaching for the holster under his jacket. He was a professional, and he knew the game was up. He was going to end it right there, in front of everyone. But Silas was faster. A muffled thud echoed through the hall as a beanbag round from a tactical rifle in the balcony hit Blackwood in the chest, sending him sprawling into the lilies. The screaming started then, a wave of panic that Sloan tried to ride to the exit. "You won't get away with this," she hissed as she tried to shove past me. "I have the contracts. I have the board's support. You have nothing." I whispered in her ear as the police, the real police, led by a captain I'd known for 30 years, swarmed the building. "The board meeting isn't in 5 days, Sarah. I moved it. It happened an hour ago. You're already fired. And the DA is waiting for you in the lobby with a warrant for medical fraud and attempted murder." She looked at me then, her eyes full of a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "I should have killed you at the funeral," she spat. "You should have," I agreed. "But you were too busy looking at the salad forks." As they led her away in handcuffs, the pearls she'd stolen from my wife caught on the railing and snapped, scattering across the floor like tears. I knelt down, picking up a single white orb. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Dr. Davis. "It's over, Harrison," she said quietly. "No," I replied, looking at the door where Silas was already waiting with Leo. "The revenge is over. The building, That's just beginning. But as I walked toward my grandson, I saw a shadow in the corner of the room that didn't belong. A man I didn't recognize, dressed in a waiter's uniform, was staring at me with an expression that wasn't shock or fear. It was recognition. He tapped his ear and whispered into a hidden mic. The old man's back in play. Phase 2 is a go. I didn't know it yet, but Sloan Montgomery was just the front office for a much larger enemy. The silence that follows a public execution is never truly quiet. It's a thick, ringing vibration, like the hum of a power transformer right before it blows. As the police marched Sarah Jenkins, the woman I had known as Sloan Montgomery, out of the Union League, the elite of Philadelphia stood frozen, their champagne flattening in their glasses. I stood at the center of the wreckage, a man in a $4,000 suit who still felt the ghost of grease under his fingernails. I reached out and took Leo's hand. He was trembling, his small fingers cold against my palm. He didn't look at the woman being shoved into the back of a cruiser. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a question I wasn't sure I could answer yet. "Is the bridge still broken, Grandpa?" he whispered. "No, Leo," I said, pulling him close so he wouldn't see the tears in my own eyes. "We're just building it with better materials now." I signaled to Silas, who was already moving toward the mysterious waiter I'd spotted. But the man was a shadow. By the time Silas reached the service corridor, the waiter's jacket was draped over a trash can, and the back exit was swinging shut. Silas didn't chase him. He knew better than to leave me and Leo unguarded in a room full of people who now realized I held their mortgages, their board seats, and their futures. "Harrison," Silas said, stepping back to my side, his voice a low vibration of warning. The waiter. He wasn't just a witness, he was a professional, and he wasn't looking at Sloan. He was looking at you like you were a piece of hardware he was sent to decommission. I felt a cold prickle of realization. Sloan Sarah had been a parasite, yes. She had been greedy and cruel. But the sheer scale of her operation, the fake medical trials, the offshore accounts, the sophisticated character assassination, it was too clean for a girl from Scranton who'd barely finished community college. She'd had a silent partner, a backer who wanted Vanguard Industrial not just liquidated, but gutted from the inside out. I didn't know it yet, but the war I thought I had just finished was merely the opening skirmish. We retreated to the Sterling penthouse in Rittenhouse Square. It was a place I hadn't stepped foot in for 3 years, a sprawling glass and steel fortress that looked out over the city. To Leo, it was a palace. To me, it was a tomb of glass that Eleanor had never gotten to see. I sat him down in the library, surrounded by the first editions I'd collected not for status, but for the smell of old paper and the weight of history. "Grandpa?" Leo asked, tracing the gold lettering on a spine. "Are you really the boss of the big buildings?" "I'm the man who makes sure the buildings stay up, Leo," I said, sitting on the edge of a leather chair that cost more than my old studio apartment's yearly rent. "But remember what I told you? It doesn't matter if you're the boss or the guy sweeping the floor. What matters is that you do the work with a clean heart. Your mom, she forgot how to do that." I left him with a trusted nanny, someone Silas had vetted through 3 layers of security, and went into the private study. Silas was already there, his laptop open, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a dozen data streams. "We cracked the Phase 2 comms," Silas said, not looking up. "The waiter? His name is Jax Vane. No relation to me, thankfully. He's a tactical industrialist. He works for Vane, Blackwood Global, a private equity firm out of Chicago. They don't buy companies, Harrison. They harvest them. They find a legacy firm with a lot of cash and a weak leadership structure, and they plant a seed. A disruptor." "Sloan," I breathed. "Exactly. She didn't find Garrett by accident. They scouted him. They knew he was the heir to Vanguard, and they knew he was the kind of man who would fall for a woman who promised him the world. They coached her. They gave her the Montgomery identity, the Greenwich backstory, the Ivy League polish. She was their Trojan horse. And once Garrett got sick, which, looking at these pharmaceutical ties, might not have been a total accident, she was supposed to trigger the liquidation. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The idea that my son's life had been a calculated casualty in a corporate takeover wasn't just a betrayal, it was a violation of the natural order. I thought of Garrett's final recording, his thin voice talking about the truth in the foundation. If she was their pawn, why did she try to kill me? I asked. If she had just stayed the course, they would have had the company by the tenth. Because Sarah Jenkins got greedy? Silas said, finally looking up. She started believing her own lie. She didn't want to hand the harvest over to Vane, Blackwood. She wanted to keep the Sterling Empire for herself. She was trying to double-cross the devil, Harrison. That's why she was so desperate to get rid of you. You were the only one who could see the cracks in her mask. The waiter hadn't been there to protect Sloane. He had been there to watch her fail. And now that she was in a cell, the harvest was being handled by the professionals. What's their move? They're triggering the default clause in the Vanguard Charter, Silas explained. It's an old provision from when you took the company public in Chinwe Lum. If the majority shareholder, that's you, is ever formally accused of a felony involving company property, the board has 48 hours to appoint an emergency receiver, and the firm lined up for that receivership. Vane, Blackwood. The arson, I whispered. The fire at the mill. Exactly. Sloane thought she was burning evidence, but Vane, Blackwood, were the ones who provided the contractor, Blackwood. They didn't just want the mill gone, they wanted you tied to the match. The news report about you being an arsonist wasn't just Sloane's spite, it was the legal trigger for the takeover. I looked out the window at the Philadelphia skyline. The lights of the city felt like a mocking audience. I had spent 40 years building a legacy of integrity, of sterling quality, and in 48 hours, a group of suit-and-tie ghouls from Chicago were going to use a lie to steal the retirement funds of 26,000 employees. I felt the old fire, the one that had fueled me through the Motrum Haimui degree shifts at the blast furnace, roar back to life. They think I'm an old man who's out of breath, I said, my voice dropping an octave. They think because I've been living in a studio apartment and taking the bus that I've forgotten how to fight. They're about to learn that the reason I stay in the shadows isn't because I'm afraid of the light. It's because I hunt better in the dark. What's the play? Silas asked, his hand drifting toward his holster. We're not going to fight the arson charge in court, I said. We're going to let them think they have me. I want you to leak to the press that I'm shattered by the revelation of Sloane's identity. Tell them I've checked myself into a private sanitarium for observation. You're going into cover? I'm going into the foundation, I corrected. Garrett said the truth was in the mill. The fire didn't destroy the vault, Silas. It just cleared away the junk on top of it. I need to get back into that basement without Vane, Blackwood knowing I'm there. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in deception. While the city's tabloids screamed about the downfall of the Sterling dynasty, I was in the back of a beat-up Ford F Matrumnam Mui, wearing my old grease-stained coveralls. Silas dropped me 2 blocks from the smoking ruins of the Sterling mill. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, guarded by a private security firm, men in tactical gear with Vane, Blackwood patches on their shoulders. This is a high-stakes play, Harrison, Silas whispered into my earpiece as I slipped into the shadows of a neighboring warehouse. If they catch you, the arsonist narrative becomes a life sentence. I built these sewers, Silas, I replied, clicking a heavy iron grate open with a specialized wrench. I know how to get into my own house. The descent into the Philadelphia underground was a journey through my own history. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water and old iron. I moved with a grace that would have surprised Sloane, the grace of a man who spent his youth climbing scaffolding and dodging swinging beams. My knees ached and my lungs burned, but every step was for Garrett. Every breath was for Leo. I reached the sublevel of the mill at Ba Hong AM. The basement was a flooded nightmare of charred timber and twisted metal, but the vault, a 6-foot cube of reinforced, heat-resistant steel, sat undisturbed in the corner, looking like a monolith from another world. I reached for the keypad but stopped. The keypad was smashed. Not by fire, by a sledgehammer. Someone had already been here. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. I pulled a small, high-intensity flashlight from my pocket and scanned the floor. There, in the soot, was a single, fresh footprint. A tactical boot. Size Moimut. Silas, I whispered. I'm not alone. Get out of there, Harrison. The sensors just tripped. We have 3 vehicles incoming. But I couldn't leave. If I left now, I was just an old man running in the dark. I needed the contents of that vault. I needed the leverage Garrett had died for. I pulled a manual bypass tool from my belt, a device I'd designed myself 30 years ago, and jammed it into the vault's emergency release. The door groaned, a sound like a giant grinding his teeth. It swung open 3 inches. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't patents. It was a single, leather-bound ledger and a series of high-definition photographs. I grabbed them, stuffing them into my jacket just as the heavy thud of boots echoed on the floor above me. Flashlights! Down there! A voice barked. I didn't run for the sewers. I ran for the old freight elevator, a manual lift, that ran on a counterweight system I'd greased myself every year for a decade. I hopped onto the platform and pulled the cable. As I ascended, a beam of light cut through the darkness below. A man in a waiter's uniform, Jax Vane, stood at the edge of the vault, his face a mask of cold, professional fury. He didn't shout. He didn't fire. He just looked up at me as I disappeared into the ceiling. "You're playing a losing hand, Sterling," he called out, his voice echoing in the hollow shaft. "The foundation is ours now." I didn't answer. I reached the ground floor, slipped through a shattered window, and vanished into the Philly night. When I reached the safe house and opened the ledger, my hands finally began to shake. It wasn't just a record of bribes, it was a map. Garrett hadn't just been tracking Sloane's harvest. He had been tracking the real power behind Vane, Blackwood, and the name at the top of the pyramid wasn't a stranger. It was Julian Harrison, my younger brother, the man who had disappeared 40 years ago after I refused to let him use our father's mill as a front for a Kensington drug ring. The man who had spent 4 decades becoming the monster I always feared he could be. He didn't just want the company, Silas, I said, staring at a photo of Julian taken 6 months ago in London. He wanted my life. He used Sloane to kill my son, and now he's using the law to kill my legacy. "Harrison," Silas said, his voice urgent. "Look at the last page of the ledger." I turned the page. There was a list of addresses. One of them was circled in red. The Kensington Preparatory Academy. My heart stopped. The Phase 2 wasn't about the board meeting. It wasn't about the company. It was about Leo. Julian knew that as long as there was a Sterling heir, his victory was temporary. He didn't want to just win. He wanted to prune the family tree until only he remained. "Get the car," I said, my voice no longer that of an old man, but of a king at war. "And Silas, call the mill workers. The ones who retired last year. The ones Sloane called worthless. Tell them the founder is calling in a final shift. And this time, we're not making steel. We're making history." I looked at the charcoal suit hanging in the corner. I wouldn't be needing it. I picked up my old heavy-duty work belt and buckled it over my coveralls. I didn't know it yet. I whispered to the empty room. But the quietest person in the room was about to become the loudest sound Julian Harrison had ever heard. The drive from the safe house to the Iron Anchor, a windowless brick dive bar in the shadow of the Gerard Point Bridge, felt like a descent into the underworld. I stared out at the passing streetlights, my reflection in the window looking like a stranger. The man in the glass had hollowed-out eyes and skin the color of wet cement, but the jaw was set with a terrifying, familiar rigidity. I was 74, my son was dead, my daughter-in-law was a professional ghost, and my brother was a monster. To the police, I was a senile arsonist. To the world, I was a cautionary tale. But as I touched the heavy brass wrench in my work belt, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the architect of a storm. "They're already at the school, Harrison," Silas said, his voice tight as he navigated the narrow, potholed streets of South Philly. Vane, Blackwood's security detail, replaced the school's regular guards an hour ago. They're calling it an enhanced protection protocol due to the arsonist threat. They're using your own manufactured notoriety as a reason to cage your grandson. They aren't protecting him, Silas. They're holding him as collateral for the January TAMF meeting, I said. "Julian knows I can't be bought, but he thinks I can be broken. He's forgotten that you can't break something that's already been through the furnace." We pulled up to the Iron Anchor. In the gravel lot sat a fleet of vehicles that looked like a scrapyard come to life. Rusted F. Matrumnum Moos, beat-up El Caminos, and a few heavy-duty service vans with faded Sterling Industrial decals still clinging to the doors. These were the men Sloane had called cogs. The men she claimed had never contributed anything meaningful to society. I stepped out of the car. The cold air smelled of salt and diesel. A dozen men were leaning against the trucks, their faces etched with the deep lines of decades spent in the heat of the mill. These were the ghosts of my past. Miller, a master welder who'd lost 2 fingers in the Tarm-Moo-born expansion. Garrett Sr., who'd been my son's godfather. And Vane, the real Vane, who could fix a steam turbine with a paperclip and a prayer. As I walked toward them, the talking stopped. They didn't see the billionaire or the arsonist. They saw the man who had stood beside them on the line when the unions went on strike and the scabs came with bats. "Harrison," Miller said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the gravel. "Heard you've been busy burning things down. Thought you'd retired from the pyrotechnics." "I'm not the one with the matches, Miller," I said, my voice carrying over the low hum of the bridge traffic. "But I am the one with the bill. You all heard what the papers are saying. You heard what my daughter-in-law said about the men who built this city. She called you worthless. She said your lives were cogs in a machine you didn't own. A low, dangerous murmur rippled through the group. I'm here because they've got my grandson, I continued, stepping into the center of the circle. They've got him locked in that fancy school in Kensington, and they're planning to ship him off to Europe so they can gut your pensions and turn Vanguard into a shell company for a Chicago hedge fund. My brother, Julian, is behind it. He wants to erase us. He wants to prove that the Sterling name belongs to the man with the most lawyers, not the men with the most scars. Miller stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. What do you need us to do, boss? We're a little old for a jailbreak. We're not breaking in, I said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. We're doing a maintenance audit. Kensington Prep sits on top of the old 19th century steam tunnels. The school's HVAC and security systems were installed by a subsidiary of Titan Manufacturing back in Chin. I still have the master overrides. While Vane, Blackwood are looking at the front gates with their high-tech cameras, we're going to remind them why you don't mess with the men who understand the foundation. The plan was a symphony of blue-collar sabotage. We moved out in a convoy, bypassing the main roads where the police patrols were looking for my sedan. We arrived at the Kensington district at Bourne. Bamui. A.M. The hour when the city is at its most vulnerable. The transition between the night dwellers and the commuters. Silas and I slipped into the maintenance access point 2 blocks from the school. Behind us came Miller and Vane, carrying heavy tool bags that didn't contain guns, but things far more disruptive. We moved through the steam tunnels, the air thick and tasting of limestone dust. I felt the vibration of the city above us, the rhythmic thud of the SEPTA trains, the distant roar of the interstate. It was the heartbeat of the Philadelphia I had helped build, and right now, it felt like it was on my side. We're under the gym, Silas whispered, checking his tablet. The security hub is directly above us. If we trip the fire suppression system from the sub-level, the magnetic locks on the classrooms will fail safe to open. It's a state requirement for school safety. Vane. Blackwood's private encryption won't matter if the physical hardware thinks the building is melting. Do it, I said. Miller and Vane went to work on the main steam valves. With a series of synchronized turns, they bypassed the regulators. High-pressure steam began to hiss through the pipes, and within seconds, the school's thermal sensors went into a frenzy. Above us, I heard the muffled sound of alarms, not the sharp ring of a burglar alarm, but the deep, pulsing whoop of a structural emergency. I climbed the maintenance ladder, pushing aside the heavy steel grate that led into the janitor's closet. I stepped out into the hallway, the air already beginning to haze with redirected steam. The hallway was a chaos of blinking red lights. 2 of Julian's men, tactical types in black vests, came running around the corner, their flashlights cutting through the mist. They looked like something out of a movie, but they were out of their element. They were looking for an intruder. They weren't prepared for a building that was turning against them. Sector 4 is compromised, one shouted into his radio. The pipes are bursting. We need to evacuate the asset. They didn't see me until I was right behind them. I didn't use a gun. I used a pressurized fire extinguisher. The heavy blast of CO high blinding them and knocking them back into the lockers. As they scrambled to regain their footing, Silas emerged from the shadows, neutralizing them with a clinical efficiency that reminded me why I'd kept him on the payroll for 40 years. Go, Harrison, Silas barked. I'll hold the hallway. Get Leo. I ran toward the north wing, where the dormitories for the legacy students were located. The steam was thicker here, the heat rising. I reached room Hightrum Lairborn Leo's room. The door was locked, the electronic keypad flashing red. I didn't try to hack it. I didn't have time. I pulled a master key from my belt, the one that worked on every Titangent manufactured lock ever made. The door clicked open. Leo was sitting on his bed, his knees pulled up to his chest, his eyes wide with terror. He was wearing his little pajamas with the rocket ships on them. When he saw me, he didn't run. He didn't scream. He just stared. "Grandpa?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Is the school on fire?" "No, little man," I said, crossing the room in 3 strides and lifting him into my arms. He felt so light, too light, like he was made of balsa wood. "The school is just having a little trouble with its plumbing. We're going on a trip, remember, to finish the bridge. Mom said you were sick. Your mom was wrong about a lot of things, Leo, but right now, we need to be quiet. We're going to play a game called The Invisible Man. Can you do that for me?" He nodded, burying his face in my neck. I could feel his heart racing, a frantic thrumming against my chest. As I turned to leave the room, a shadow blocked the doorway. It wasn't a tactical guard. It was Jax Vane. He was leaning against the doorframe, his waiter's jacket gone, replaced by a gray tactical fleece. He was holding a suppressed pistol, but he wasn't pointing it at me. He was pointing it at the floor. "You're a persistent old man, Harrison," Jack said, his voice eerily calm against the backdrop of the alarms. "I have to admit, the steam tunnel play was inspired. Julian didn't think you had the stomach for it." "Julian never understood that a foundation is more than just concrete, Jax," I said, shielding Leo with my body. "It's made of the people who know how the building breathes. Now move." "I can't do that. You see, I'm not just a tactical industrialist. I'm an investment protector. And right now, that boy is the most valuable asset on the Vane Blackwood balance sheet. He's a 6-year-old boy," I spat. "Not a balance sheet. In this world, there's no difference." Jax finally raised the gun, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory focus. "Give me the boy, Harrison. You can walk out of here. We'll even drop the arson charges. You can go back to your studio apartment, take the bus, and live out your days in the quiet. Isn't that what you wanted? To be invisible?" I looked at Jax, and then I looked at the manila folder I'd tucked into my waistband, the one from the Mills vault. The truth about Julian. The truth about Vane Blackwood. "You think you've won because you have the guns," I said, my voice low and steady. "But you've forgotten the first rule of the mill. Never stand in the path of the poor." I didn't wait for him to react. I kicked the heavy brass valve on the wall behind me, the one Miller had loosened. A jet of scalding, high-pressure steam erupted directly between me and Jax. He cried out, shielding his face as the white cloud blinded the room. I dove for the maintenance hatch in the floor of the closet. We dropped into the darkness just as a flurry of suppressed shots hissed through the steam where we had been standing. We were back in the tunnels, the roar of the pipes echoing like a dragon's breath. I ran, carrying Leo, my lungs screaming for air, my knees buckling with every step. I was 74, and I was carrying the weight of my entire legacy. When we finally emerged in the basement of the Iron Anchor 3 blocks away, I collapsed onto the concrete floor. Silas was there, his face groomed with soot, helping me up. "We got him," Silas breathed, looking at Leo. "We actually got him." "We're not safe yet," I said, coughing as I handed Leo to Miller. "Julian will know what happened. He'll be at the Vanguard building now, trying to accelerate the board meeting. He'll try to liquidate everything before the sun comes up. Then we go to the building," Silas said. "No," I said, standing up and wiping the grease from my forehead. "We don't go to the building. Julian owns the building. He owns the board. He owns the narrative." I pulled out the ledger I'd taken from the mill vault. I opened it to the middle section, the part Garrett had marked with his own blood. "We go to the source," I said. "Garrett didn't just track Julian's money. He tracked his partner. The person Julian is really working for. The person who's been funding Vane Blackwood from the beginning." Silas leaned in, his eyes widening as he read the name on the ledger. "Harrison, if this is true, this isn't just a family feud. This is a coup of the entire Philadelphia industrial sector." "It's more than that," I said. "It's the reason Eleanor died. It's the reason the experimental treatments failed Garrett. It wasn't just Sarah Jenkins being greedy. It was a targeted assassination of the Sterling bloodline." The name on the ledger was Senator Elias Sterling Vane, my cousin, the golden boy of Pennsylvania politics, the man who had been giving the eulogy at Garrett's funeral while his partners were burning my mill. "I'm hitting rock bottom, Silas," I said, looking at the men gathered in the dive bar. "But the thing about rock bottom is that it's the best place to start a foundation." I picked up the phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the press. I called the one person who could bypass the board, the senator, and the hedge fund in a single move. "Jennifer?" I said when the CEO of the Philadelphia Stock Exchange answered. "It's Harrison Sterling. I'm declaring a legacy crisis at Vanguard Industrial. I want a total trading halt on our shares effective immediately. And Jennifer, call the FBI's racketeering division. Tell them I have the ledger, the real one." But as I hung up, the lights in the Iron Anchor flickered and died. The hum of the bridge traffic seemed to vanish, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of helicopters approaching from the river. "They found us," Miller said, reaching for a heavy iron pipe. "Let them come," I said, stepping into the center of the dark room, the ledger held tight against my chest. "I've spent 40 years being the quietest person in the room. It's time to see what happens when I scream." The heavy steel door of the bar groaned as it was kicked off its hinges. But it wasn't a tactical team that stepped through the smoke. It was my brother, Julian. He was alone, dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than the bar, a small, silver remote in his hand. "Hello, Harrison." Julian said, his voice a silk-wrapped razor. Did you really think I'd let a group of factory workers take what belongs to me? You were always the favorite, weren't you? The builder. The hero. But heroes don't survive the collapse. They just get buried in it. He pressed a button on the remote, and a muffled explosion rocked the foundation of the bar. Dust rained from the ceiling. The mill was just a distraction. Harrison, Julian smiled. The real fire is already burning under the Vanguard building. Your employees, your legacy, your pensions, they're all turning to ash as we speak. Unless, of course, you give me that ledger. I looked at my brother, the man who shared my blood and had poisoned my soul. And then I looked at the men behind me, the worthless ones. The ledger isn't the weapon, Julian, I said, stepping forward. We are. The dust from the explosion tasted like limestone and old regrets. Julian stood in the wreckage of the Iron Anchor's doorway, the silver remote in his hand glowing with a tiny, malicious blue light. He looked like a man who had never seen a day of hard labor in his life, his skin too smooth, his suit too sharp, his soul too hollow. He was the brother I had tried to forget, the shadow that had finally grown long enough to swallow my family whole. You always did like the theatrics, Julian, I said, my voice steady despite the ringing in my ears. I shifted my weight, feeling the cold weight of the ledger against my ribs. But you're losing your touch. That explosion? It didn't take out the foundation. It just took out the vintage plumbing. You're making a mess of a perfectly good dive bar, and Miller here is very particular about his draft lines. Miller stepped up beside me, a heavy iron pipe resting casually on his shoulder. Behind him, the other retired cogs of Sterling Industrial moved like a wall of living stone. They didn't look afraid. They looked annoyed. Julian's eyes flickered, a momentary tremor of uncertainty crossing his face as he looked at the grizzled men who treated his high-tech threats like a minor inconvenience. You think these relics can protect you? Julian sneered, recovered his poise. I've already initiated the thermal purge at the Vanguard headquarters. In 20 minutes, the mainframe, the one containing the encryption keys for the pension funds and the proprietary patents, will be a puddle of molten silicon. The senator is already on the floor of the legislature, ready to declare a state of industrial emergency. By sunrise, Vanguard will be nationalized under a receivership I control. You'll be a penniless arsonist, and your grandson will be a ward of a state that answers to me. I looked at my brother, and for the first time in 40 years, I felt a wave of genuine pity. He had spent his entire life studying the architecture of power, but he had never learned how to actually build anything. He thought the building was the company. He thought the hardware was the legacy. Julian, I said softly, stepping toward him. Why do you think I lived in a studio apartment for 10 years? Why do you think I took the bus? Why do you think the factory worker never bought a penthouse until he had to rescue his grandson? Because you were a pathetic, guilt-ridden old man, Julian spat. Because you couldn't handle the weight of what we were born to be. No, I said, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. It's because I spent 10 years and $400 million building the real Vanguard. You're burning a decoy, Julian. The building on Market Street. That's just a front office for the lawyers and the lobbyists. The actual servers, the ones that hold the Sterling patents and the retirement funds for every man in this room, aren't in a skyscraper. They're 40 feet underground, in the North Philly basement of a converted steel warehouse. A warehouse you've never even visited because it doesn't have a helipad. The color drained from Julian's face. The silver remote in his hand suddenly looked like a toy. You're lying. The blueprints you stole from Garrett's office were the ones I drafted in Mutngin Chin Trum Chin Mui Tarm. I interrupted. I leaked them to Sarah Jenkins 6 months ago. I knew she was your mole, Julian. I knew she'd give them to you. I let you spend $40 million of the senator's money to set a fire in an empty shell. Harrison, be careful, Silas yelled. Julian lunged, not for me, but for the radio on his shoulder. Jax, abort the purge. Change coordinates to the North Philly site. Now. But the radio only emitted a burst of static. Then, a voice came through, not Jax Vane's cold, professional tone, but the calm, melodic voice of Claire, my CEO. I'm afraid Mr. Vane is currently being detained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Julian, Claire said. It turns out that using a tactical industrialist to commit arson is a violation of several RICO statutes. And your Phase 2 waiter. He's currently explaining your relationship with Senator Elias Sterling Vane to a very interested assistant U.S. attorney. STC. Julian threw the radio against the wall, the plastic shattering into 100 pieces. He reached into his jacket, his hand coming out with a compact, high-caliber pistol. He didn't point it at me. He pointed it at Miller. "Give me the ledger, Harrison," Julian hissed, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "The senator. He has friends. Deep ones. This isn't over just because you moved some servers. I'll burn this city to the ground before I let you humiliate me again." I didn't blink. I didn't reach for a weapon. I just looked at the men around me, the men Julian called relics. "You think the ledger is the truth, Julian?" I asked, pulling the leather-bound book from my jacket. "The truth isn't in these pages. The truth is in the blood. You want to know why the experimental treatments failed, Garrett? You think it was just a bad drug trial?" I opened the ledger to a page Garrett had marked with a yellow sticky note. It wasn't a financial record. It was a DNA profile. "Garrett figured it out, Julian. That's why you had to kill him. He realized that the experimental drugs weren't designed to cure cancer. They were designed to trigger a specific genetic failure in the Sterling bloodline, a failure that you don't have. Because you aren't my brother, Julian." The room went so quiet I could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the iron anchor's walls. Julian froze, the gun trembling in his hand. What? What did you say?" "I found the hospital records from Mutngin Chin Trum Numwe Hai," I said, my voice heavy with a grief I hadn't known I was carrying. "Our mother. She lost her second child in the winter. My father, desperate and broken, didn't want her to know. He took a child from an unregistered clinic in Kensington, a child left behind by a family of grifters named Blackwood. He raised you as a Sterling to save my mother's heart. But the Sterling blood, the iron in our veins, it was never yours." Julian's face didn't just go white. It seemed to hollow out, the very structure of his identity collapsing. "No, that's a lie. You're trying to mess with my head. I'm a Sterling. I'm the one who deserves the empire." "You're a Blackwood, Julian," I said, stepping closer until the barrel of his gun was inches from my chest. "The contractor you hired to burn my mill, he's your cousin. The firm Vane, Blackwood, that wasn't a professional partnership. It was a family reunion. You weren't trying to take over the family business. You were trying to destroy the family that stole you from the gutter." Julian let out a raw, animalistic scream and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small space, but the bullet didn't hit me. Miller had swung his iron pipe, catching Julian's arm just as the hammer fell. The shot went wide, shattering a bottle of whiskey behind the bar. Before Julian could fire again, 5 of the retired mill workers were on him, a mountain of flannel and muscle that didn't need tactical training to neutralize a man who'd never been in a real fight. I stood over my brother as he lay pinned to the floor, gasping for air. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. "You're dead to this family, Julian," I said, echoing the words Sarah Jenkins had said to me at the funeral. "But unlike me, you'll stay that way. The FBI is outside. The senator is already resigning. And the Sterling name? It's going back to the people who actually earn it." I turned to Silas, who was holding Leo. My grandson was looking at the scene with a quiet, observant intensity. I walked over and took him from Silas's arms. "Is the game over, Grandpa?" Leo asked. "The game is over, Leo," I said, kissing the top of his head. "Now we start the work." But as the police sirens began to wail outside, Silas's tablet chimed, a high-priority alert. He looked at the screen, and his face went grave. "Harrison, we have a problem. Sarah Jenkins. She's in a cell, Silas. She's not going anywhere." "She was in a cell," Silas said, showing me the screen. "There was a transport accident 10 minutes ago on the way to the federal holding facility. The van was hit by a semi-truck. The guards are dead. Sarah. She's gone." I looked at the ledger, then at the empty doorway of the bar. Sarah Jenkins, the woman who had spent 5 years learning every secret of the Sterling family, was out there. And she didn't just have the names of our accounts. She had the one thing Julian and the senator never had. She had a mother she hated, and a son she treated like a pawn. "She's going for the Bucks County farmhouse," I realized. "The willow tree. She thinks that's where I hid the real physical assets." "The farm is empty, Harrison," Silas said. "There's nothing there but ghosts." "No," I said, my heart sinking into my stomach. "There's one thing there. Eleanor's journals. The ones that contain the bypass codes for the secondary trust. If Sarah gets those, she can lock me out of the North Philly servers from a burner phone in a motel room." I looked at my men. They were exhausted, battered, and old. But as I met Miller's eyes, he just nodded and reached for his keys. "One more shift, boss?" he asked. "One more shift," I replied. We raced toward the countryside, the city of Philadelphia fading into a blur of neon and shadow. The reversal had begun. I had hit rock bottom. I had revealed the truth, and I had reclaimed my grandson. But as we crossed the county line, I saw the orange glow of a new fire on the horizon. Sarah wasn't just looking for the journals. She was finishing what Julian had started. She was burning the only place that still felt like home. I didn't know it yet. I whispered, holding Leo tight against me as the truck roared into the dark. But the final twist wasn't about the money or the name. It was about what happens when you try to burn the man who knows exactly how to build a fire. The orange glow on the horizon wasn't just a fire, it was the funeral pyre of my sanctuary. The Bucks County farmhouse, a stone and timber sanctuary that had stood since the late McGinn-Tam Trums, was framed against the black silk of the Pennsylvania night. As Miller's truck skidded to a halt on the gravel driveway, the heat hit the windshield like a physical wall. I didn't wait for Silas to clear the area. I didn't wait for the cogs to grab their extinguishers. I climbed out of the truck, the smell of burning cedar and ancient dust filling my lungs, and I ran toward the porch. "Harrison, no," Silas yelled. But I was already through the threshold. The interior was a hurricane of smoke and memories. The staircase where Garrett had practiced his first clumsy steps was already being licked by flames. In the center of the living room, illuminated by the fire eating through the rafters, stood Sarah Jenkins. She wasn't the polished Sloane Montgomery anymore. Her designer coat was torn, her face was smeared with soot and blood from the van crash, and her eyes were wide with a frantic, animalistic hunger. She was clutching Eleanor's leather-bound journals to her chest like a holy relic. "You're too late, Harrison," she screamed over the roar of the blaze. "I have them, the bypass codes, the routing numbers for the secondary trust, everything your invisible wife kept from the world. I'm taking it all. You can have the ashes." I stopped 10 feet away from her. A heavy beam ground above us, showering the floor in sparks. I didn't look at the fire. I looked at the woman who had tried to erase my son's soul. "The codes aren't what you think they are, Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady. "Eleanor didn't keep financial records in those journals. She kept her heart. And she kept a record of the one thing you never bothered to understand about the Sterling family." "Don't lie to me," Sarah hissed, her fingers digging into the old leather. "Julian told me. He said the legacy trust was buried in the foundation of this house. He said it was the fallback for when the board turned." Julian was a Blackwood, Sarah. He looked for power in numbers. He looked for legacy in vaults, I said, stepping closer. "But the legacy trust isn't a bank account. It's a multi-signature lock. Garrett helped Eleanor set it up when he was 21. He knew the world was full of people like you, people who think a name is something you can steal." The ceiling ground again. A piece of the chandelier shattered on the floor between us. Sarah's grip on the journals tightened. "I'll crack it. I'll hire the best hackers in the world. Once I'm in Europe, You can't crack a lock that requires a heartbeat, Sarah. The secondary trust is a character trust. It only releases the funds, the hundreds of millions meant for the workers' pensions and Leo's future, if the majority of the Sterling industrial retirees sign off on the recipient's integrity. It's not a password. It's a vote." Sarah froze. The fire reflected in her eyes, making her look like she was burning from the inside out. "A vote? You're telling me my future depends on those old men in the trucks?" "The cogs, Sarah. The men you called worthless. They are the trustees. They are the vault. Garrett wanted it that way. He told me, Dad, if anyone ever tries to take the company from the people who built it, they'll have to convince the men who sweat for it. And I don't think Miller is feeling very generous tonight." The realization hit her like a physical blow. The journals she was holding weren't a map to a treasure. They were a record of her own failure. She looked down at the books, then back at me, a jagged, desperate laugh escaping her throat. "Then no one gets it. If I can't have the life I earned, I'll burn the history of the one you loved." She lunged toward the fireplace, intending to hurl the journals into the heart of the blaze, but she tripped on a loose floorboard one I had fixed with Garrett 20 years ago. As she fell, the journals flew from her hands. I didn't go for the books. I went for Sarah. I grabbed her arm, hauling her back from the edge of the collapsing floor. For a split second, we were locked together, the factory worker and the socialite, the builder and the parasite, while the house of our shared history burned around us. "Let me go," she shrieked. "I'd rather die in here than go back to that cell." "You're not dying tonight, Sarah," I said, pulling her toward the exit. "You're going to live. You're going to live in a world where everyone knows your real name. You're going to live with the knowledge that you had the love of a man like Garrett Sterling, and you traded it for a title that didn't even exist." Silas and Miller burst through the door then, dragging us both out into the cool night air just as the roof of the farmhouse gave way. The sound was like a thunderclap, a final, heavy punctuation mark on the life I had known. We sat on the grass, watching the flames consume the rest. Sarah was being cuffed by the state troopers who had finally arrived, her face a mask of silent, hollow defeat. Silas handed me the journals he'd managed to snatch them from the floor before the collapse. They were singed at the edges, smelling of smoke, but whole. I opened Eleanor's final journal to the very last page. There was a note there, written in her elegant, looping script, dated 2 weeks before she died. Harrison, if the day ever comes when the shadows get too long, look at the hands of the people beside you. That is where our wealth is. Not in the steel, but in the grip. Teach Garrett that. Teach Leo that. A Sterling doesn't own a company. They carry a community. I closed the book and looked at the men standing around the trucks. Miller, Vane, the Godfather. They were soot-stained, tired, and old. But they were standing tall. The aftermath was a whirlwind of justice and rebuilding. Senator Elias Sterling Vane didn't just resign. He turned state's evidence against Vane, Blackwood Global, to avoid a life sentence. The Phase 2 coup was dismantled by the FBI within a month. Julian Harrison, the man who was actually a Blackwood, vanished into the federal prison system, a man without a name or a legacy. And Sarah? She's serving 20 years for medical fraud and her role in the arson. She occasionally sends letters to Leo from the Muncie State Correctional Institution. I don't hide them from him. I let him read them, but I also make sure he understands the difference between a mother who loves you and a woman who uses you. 1 year later, the January 10th board meeting was held not in a mahogany boardroom, but in the newly rebuilt Sterling Community Center in Kensington. I walked into the room wearing my old Muilam Dola Goodwill blazer. I wasn't there to take the VP position. I was there to announce the transformation of Vanguard Industrial into a worker-owned cooperative. My name is Harrison Sterling, I told the gathered employees and the press. For 40 years, you've been told that success is something that trickles down from the top. Today, we're proving that success is something that grows from the ground up. The Legacy Trust is now the Employee Equity Fund. No one person owns this company anymore. We all do. Because a building is only as strong as its foundation. The room erupted. It wasn't the polite applause of a country club. It was the roar of 26,000 people who finally realized they weren't cogs. They were the machine. After the meeting, I took Leo to the old mill site. The rubble had been cleared away, and in its place was a park, the Eleanor Sterling Memorial Commons. In the center of the park stood a bridge, a full-scale version of the balsa wood model we had finished together. "Grandpa?" Leo asked, running his hand over the reinforced steel railing. "Is this the one we built?" "This is the one we built, Leo," I said, sitting on a bench and watching the sun set over the Delaware River. "It's made of the same steel your dad loved. And the best part is, it'll be here long after I'm gone. That's what it means to be a builder. You make things that other people get to cross." "I want to be a builder too," he said, leaning against my shoulder. "I know you do, little man, and you've already started." I looked down at my hands, my scarred, calloused, 75-year-old hands. They didn't look like the hands of a billionaire. They looked like the hands of a man who had spent his life fixing things instead of throwing them away. Sloane Sarah had been right about one thing. I was an old man who had peaked as a factory worker, but she was wrong about the peak. My peak wasn't the day I made my first million, or the day I went public. My peak was right now, sitting on a bench with my grandson, knowing that the family story hadn't been erased. It had been rewritten in a way that no fire could ever touch. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. And remember, the next time you see someone in a worn-out jacket taking the bus, don't assume they're worthless. They might just be the person who built the road you're driving on. Respect isn't a title you buy. It's the integrity you leave behind in the things you build and the people you love. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room isn't hiding. They're just waiting for the right moment to show you how deep the foundation really goes.